watch.
Cool.
What's the wood now?
Well, and off we go. Today we're learning more about psychological effects of serious games. And those guys went a bit all out in that they prescribed you guys to read 2 papers. Right. So everyone noted that and appreciated it. That's brilliant. Let's see how many paper had a look at the first paper, based given access constraints and the like. How many people had a look at the second paper? All right, that seems to be much more popular. Okay, while slightly sad, that's okay. So, all right, I think we'll just continue then. So feel free to explore, what psychological effects of serious games you suspect exist, and how we can support those, right? Either by scientific reference or otherwise. So, the floor is yours.
Yes, my name is Thomas.
My name is Kai.
And we looked into the papers that consider how the games influencing us. Some of you are working on the probably very various aspects of the influence of serious games, but some of you might treat this one as the kind of the first stage, because it's like a between stage, what's happening, how it affects learning, how it helps in decision making and awareness. So this is kind of a middle stage, how the game affects the people and what's coming after it. Then we learn in different sessions. And since it was treated as like a middle stage and quite various outcomes that could be from the serious games, so decided to take a look into a meta-analysis study, which took a number of experimental studies and decided to find if there is any kind of correlation between the studies. How do those studies do they actually lead to the one conclusion or not? First, how the serious games are defined in the paper. They were supposed to be interactive. It's kind of obvious. They have some kind of a set of agreed rules and constraints with a clear goal. They probably should have some kind of a challenge. And then, as it's from, for example, the learning perspective, it should have some kind of a constant feedback to the user that you know what's happening. And the question is, does it need to have the entertainment factor in it? Is it necessary or not? Because there are lots of the references to the entertainment games are made in the serious games. So just a question mark for the discussion later if anyone wants to join. The main way how the serious games influence are recognized two main ways how the games influence us. Is either can change the cognitive processes, or they could affect motivation. So these are the two main arguments that the authors of the papers that were analyzed in this paper. These are two main ways how the serious games influences. They built a number of hypotheses shortly that serious games should have the higher learning gains. The learning should be kept for a bit longer time, not just after the playing. They assume that they are more motivating, and also, based on the other papers, they also try to put some kind of the how strong is the effect of the games when the game itself is combined with the other instructional methods. And we repeat how with multiple sessions, when the games are repeated, is it a better outcome or not? And that when playing it alone, we'll learn more than playing in together. They used Google Scholars and reviews, both publisher and peer reviews articles, and it's quite common to use those kind of papers. What's kind of the uncommon in this paper is that they, as it's called a file drawer symptom, they also went out to the field and tried to reach the scientists, the researchers, the papers that were not published. But as long as they met the criteria that were quite well described and quite explicit, so those papers were also brought into the consideration if they are considered as valuable. So they identified 190 studies, and 38 of them met criteria, so they were included into this analysis. Those included studies, they have either comparison of the learning outcome, of how long this learning outcome consists, and the effects on the motivation. It was over 5,000 participants in those single studies, and from 16 to 1100 was on each of them. Here are some criteria and coding that were used in the study. So authors actually made kind of the very systematic to the work to identify all the aspects of the studies, such as each of the studies could be labeled with the relevant value of all of those criteria. So, like for example, the last one, narrative, it could be an Boolean value. If it's a narrative part of the game, or is it not? Or is it was it the game played in the one session or the multiplayer session? So this is kind of some of them are either or values, but some of them have a bit more details. Additionally, they decided to put some variables to the methodology. Like, for example, the not published articles, where they, if it could influence or not the results or the conclusions from the paper, if the students were assigned to or the players were assigned to the serious games voluntarily or randomly or during the class, and how the study was made. Was it only the interviews about the motivation and the outcomes after, or they were also made before and after the experiment? The main outcomes is that serious games are more effective for learning and retention of learning. They are more effective when supplied with the other instruction methods, with the multiply training sessions. What was not confirmed, that the single users actually learn more. The data analysis from the studies might bring to the conclusion that actually the people working together in the serious games environment, they learn more than if they were playing individually. And that's the stronger effect of the serious games is when the game itself or the subject of the game is focused on the problem-solving issues. Then when it's kind of the practicing aspect, like drill and practice. So those games are were found more effective. When it comes to the effect on the motivation, came to maybe some surprising conclusions. They didn't confirm the hypothesis that the serious games are more motivating, which might be because of the entertainment game assumption that games are supposed to be motivated. We want to play them. And as for the possible explanation to the situation, it's three possible explanations that they pointed. One of them came from the self-determination theory that was presented in the lecture, so I will not repeat.
Well, what was it about? Probably still important to get the essence across what the theory is about.
The essence of this is that three terms like competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So this affecting of my motivation would probably not be in place when you are playing the instructional game, when you don't have this entertainment context, when you are supposed to learn something. So this is something that you probably didn't choose yourself, the game, but the teacher for you choose it, or other. So this is one of the possible causes that you don't have the control over the what do you play, when do you play, and that it has this kind of the curriculum context of school or work, so this might be one of the explanations. The second one is going towards the game design. That this constant feedback that the games are supposed to teach us when we play them. So this is also something that might interrupt the game flow. So again about how nice is it to play the game. Maybe not that nice when it's all the time coming up the instructions or of one or other form to remind us it's not just a game. And the last one was actually most of the papers included questionnaires that were asked after the play. Yeah, it was at various time between from 1 week and to the in the edge case 27 weeks I think it was. So can we actually measure the motivation? Can we measure enjoyment in the game after it's played? Or should we rather do it while somebody's playing? So the other paper named there on the footnote, it's an example of another experiment where different body language measures were taken during the participants were playing a serious simulation game. So it's a lot of biosignals that could be measured and used to noticed all from the heart rate, pressure, muscles movement, or the version with if you concentrate only on the face with this FEMG. So there are various of tools that could be used in the during the experiment, during the play. Of 31 studies that were analyzed and were based for the conclusion that serious games are not motivating. Only one of them included the measuring of motivation during the experiment, during the play.
Mm-hmm.
And what is another special about it, that actually this one study claimed that the serious games are more motivating, but it was not enough to put it as a significant for the rest of the study. So the conclusion was made that it's not more motivating, but maybe it's just the opportunity to measure the motivation, for example, using those biosignals in the future to see if it's motivating or not. They choose the studies from the very wide domains, and this could be this choice of the studies, that criteria could be kind of jeopardizing the results. So they see it as the potential threat for the viability of the study. Some of those studies were also during the school environment. So they also raise the questions if the motivation to school in general could affect this experiment, what was the students' attitude towards the serious games. So this could be something that was not possible to determine in the study. And what also they question is the role of the competition. Do we need a competition aspect in a serious game or not, or is it just merely for the entertainment games? As I said before, there is a lot of potential for the future work, and they also recognize that the more or recent studies, empirical studies on the field, they bring more data that could be analyzed. So even using the same set of the studies, one could possibly get some other ideas, but what they did is they tried to put a very wide definition of motivation. They use many models to explain what the motivation is, and also defining the motivation itself. It's actually crucial, but if you cannot define the motivation in the correct way, then it's difficult to study it. So this is kind of important also. And since some of the variables that I talked before, some of them were used as the mediators or the moderators for the results. So two of them were noticed as having a big influence on the effect of the influence of the serious games, and it could be studied forward. How combining the serious games with another instruction types, how making a serious games in the group work context could enhance the potential of the impact of the serious games. And the last one was about both study and the design of the games itself, because if you could have some kind of the automatic reflection or be kind of forced to reflect on your action during the play without disturbing the game flow, then this kind of combination would have a very good effect on the serious game. So this is also something that might be included. Those scales that are linked down, and the ATMI it's a measure that was made for the students to measure them general attitude toward the mathematics. And the second one, it's a model of motivation that it's one of the manuals for the motivation, and this one stands for the four elements that are in this model. It's the attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. So it might remind a bit the self-derivant theory model. Yes.
Good question.
We have any questions about? I didn't put any of the tables and the data.
Because everyone knows them by heart, right?
It's kind of hard to put quite big tables.
Yeah. So,
one question.
Yes.
I heard like not serious games like Counter-Strike, like shooting each other, killing people, makes people more aggressive. What do you think about this? Like,
Hold that for.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the second part of the presentation.
Okay.
We get
Very
the
precisely.
okay.
spot on. Everyone wants to go down that route, right? You discussed
You're
that.
the first one
You're
on
not-
all the questions, so the second part.
That's right. So yeah, interesting setup how you structured it. So I think there was a lot of information on very few slides because this paper is incredibly rich. Particularly the first paper that the class was supposed to read and you have reviewed. I mean that's probably the biggest meta-analysis of serious games undertaken so far. I haven't come across any more recent. Is there a more recent version of this? That was 2013, quite a while ago, but still, nevertheless, it's very exhaustive. Is there any comments regarding this paper in terms of you highlighted some of the findings, right? So that's where that overall learning is better with serious games, particular if mixed with other means of instruction or methods of instruction, and in group settings, right? So that was the fundamental opposite finding, because previous works, as the one cited in here, the previous meta study from 2006, suggested that serious games a good idea, but it works best for individuals. But they suggest quite the opposite. It's better in a group setting. So in both cases, you advance your learning, irrespective of whether you are an individual learner or in a group-based setting. But their key point here is that the learning is significantly better in a group setting. So that's interesting, I guess. Is there anything else that was particularly insightful or surprising?
I think it's the part about the motivation that kind of intuitive. One could assume that this is kind of the alternative way of learning, getting knowledge, getting more skills, that it could be motivating, but it seems like it's still have some tools as the, for example, teacher to teach the students in a motivating way without using the serious games. But on the other hand, if you use the serious games in addition to this active and well established routines and motivating aspects, then you will get an even better effect. So maybe it's not an alternative, but a nice supplement. They work together, not opposite. It's not like that I have to choose either the active training, active instruction, passive instruction, or other mixed kind of the learning, or the serious games. They all work together very nice if you just manage to put it all in a one context, in one design.
Right. Okay.
Be a part, not the alternative.
Yeah. Okay. Other views? Perhaps off the beaten track, not necessarily from within the paper, but perhaps from your own intuition. Why is motivation? Or why does the meta-analysis, whether true or not, is another point, right? You run the next study, it will turn out differently. But putting this discussion aside, would you see possible reasons why they arrive at this assessment that motivation is actually not particularly driven by serious games? Any other reason? Clara?
You mentioned that some of them are in the education setting,
Yes.
and so if a class is like given the task of playing a serious game for educational purposes, then the motivation isn't really coming from the students. It might be coming from your grade or your teacher or something else.
Point.
And the other place that I've encountered serious games was job training. Like, it's mandatory. There's really not that much motivation coming from me to try and finish this gameplay. It's, I get a check mark at the end and then our boss pays me.
So this is exactly what's about the autonomy of choice in the self-determination. That this is what they also pointed. And since they choose the studies that were presenting data that could be analyzed using statistical methods, so it also if you choose the studies with a bit different kind of the results, it also might give you some kind of the different interpretation of the effect, because they were using Cohen's effect size for measuring how the experimental group that was playing, what was the effect on the group comparing to the control group that was using alternative source of instruction. So they were actually comparing playing a serious games towards learning from the school book or the passive instruction, or if there was some kind of active engagement in the learning context. So they actually put those papers across and compare those activities, how those studies were comparing to the control group. And of course, if there was some kind of the studies that did not have this control group, or there was nothing to compare with, so those studies were excluded. So this is also a kind of the threat to the if there was like a games that were focus on the cognitive abilities. They didn't have kind of the control group that used the other method. So although those studies might point to the different conclusions, they were not included because of the criteria of this no activity control group. So this is the authors also said in the paper that this is they made a precise list how the criteria for the inclusions should be, and from the same set of 190 studies, somebody might choose different 38. So the result might have been different or differ. They don't claim that this is the only way to do it.
Yeah, but they're fairly that's right. But they're fairly convinced that since they went so broad in their sampling, right, even including non-published materials, that their selection bias is very moderate, right? So, but yeah, of course, there's aspects.
And it doesn't stay here on the slides, but actually this variable model, they try to find if the published state is a moderator for the results, and they didn't find it. So actually, it didn't have the influence on it didn't moderate the results, where it was published, not published, or not reviewed.
Yeah.
So that was not yes.
Yeah, just one more question about like the motivation
Mm.
part. Did they point out like how the games or the studies had emphasis on entertainment purpose, or was it just solely gamifying a learning activity?
There were no entertainment game in the study at all. All of them has a purpose. To and maybe I could talk a little bit about the inclusion criteria. The experimental group were supposed to learn something through the serious game, and so this is kind of the first criteria for the study. So if the study was not about it, so it is not in this analysis. So yes, there was no entertainment, purely entertaining games, and then the influence on the motivation at all.
Yeah, I guess more like did the games try to entertain to some degree, even though they're learning something? Because I feel that matters if they try to motivate you some extrinsic way or something. I don't know if they
So
put
you-
an emphasis on it.
You should have a good response to that one because it's a good question. So I mean, I think if I rephrase your questions, right? What are the mechanics for games that have been captured by that particular survey? You know, gamification. What they use scoreboards, they use comparison tables, they use you name it, right? So all the features that we know and learn about and so love so dearly as gamers. What's the closest that the study actually considered in terms of gameplay features? And the concrete answer is no, they didn't. But there's an abstract answer that you can pick up on, because they considered one thing that is related to game design in the widest sense. They referred to level of realism.
Yes, it was. They tried to find out if the games that were kind of the more real life simulators and the schematics, like you are reading some kind of or a cartoon like. And as I recollect, they didn't find any significant differences on the level of realism.
The interesting thing, they have developed kind of a continuum for study. Either they didn't know how it looks like, right, or either it was schematic, like a very, very broadly structured, cartoonish, or realistic, approximating some sort of photorealism, whatever. They didn't go further in stratifying this, so it's like, I think those are the three main categories. And what I find though is if you look at the results, that in all cases the schematic was the preferable outcome. So the simpler the representation, probably the more detached from the actual world, the more effective it seems to be. And the more, in any case, the reliability to or the relationship between respect to learning is a factor of 46.46, so with strong significance, and 51 with motivation. So if you have a serious game that's at least the conclusion you can draw, that has schematic structures for interaction, right? A very brief, very, very blunt and probably very simplistic graphics, they may be more efficient than highly realistic serious games. So it's kind of a counterintuitive in a way, and that's as close as you get to your question, because that's the only thing they collected. But so it seems quite the opposite. So the simpler and the more abstract, it appears the learning may be more efficient. Clara.
One of the other classes in this semester is information visualization,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that actually comes up is that we're better at recognizing simple shapes than we are actually like realistic things.
Mm-hmm.
And if we see something that is mostly real but slightly fake, your brain kind of shuts it off because it's not real, and we actually respond better to those very simple schematics. So that's probably part of it.
Uncanny valley.
Yeah.
Precisely.
In addition, you're spot on, because I think that's something they discussed as well, that it's too much cognitive load on dealing with all that visual input. So if you have very simple representations, that's very cheap.
So this might be
Assessing.
why
Very point.
they notice the stronger effect when you have this problem solving, that you can focus on the problem, not to practice like Like last week we had this very nice, very realistic video when you were practicing all the stages in the hospital.
Mhm.
So this is kind of a very realistic way to drill and practice. So maybe it was not this effective because of this cognitive overload.
Yeah, or the uncanny valley, right? The disconnect, that it's nearly real but not quite, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. But note, I mean, one of the motivational aspects that was really highly correlated looking at the paper, however, there were certain areas that still seem to work well, right? So, I mean, problem solving seems to be, or problem solving related serious games seem to be highly, interacting with the idea of eliciting motivation, right? So that's quite interesting. So that coming back to the motivation study, couldn't it be that it really strongly depends on the area of interest? That's to some extent the self-determination theory angle in terms of removing your autonomy because you want to learn something you want to learn about. But could it mean that perhaps serious games that are of particular genres, particular types, or used in particular contexts will simply be more effective because people not only want to learn them, but people they are highly relevant for their activity, right? So if you think about, if you want to learn more about mathematical puzzles, and you're really keen in this, then you may choose, meaning the motivation being a prior, you may choose serious games, and then naturally it stimulates your motivation further, as opposed to playing, some either forceful workplace training games or other, strongly instructed by the educational domain you're embedded in, as opposed to being your genuine interest. So there could be a sampling issue there to suggest, hey guys, why don't you review this with light on collecting the prior motivation to a serious game before of the participants, so pre-test, and only include those in your study and use this as a moderator variable for assessing motivation of a serious game, if you follow me.
You could also try to analyze on the a bit more narrow domain choice.
Yeah.
Because they also found some differences between domains, like for example
Considerable.
biology and engineering, they were not that high effect as on the other domains. So I'm not that.
In fact, counterintuitive. In fact, even counterproductive. At least not significant, but still for engineering, it's even counterproductive to use serious games. So it's not a good idea at all, right? So
you need too many realistic details to solve the problem, and then you will get this probably. It's not that easy to focus on the problem or divide and conquer or something like that.
yeah.
You need probably some simpler kind of input for your brain to solve the problem. So then with too many details it will become overcrowded.
That's interesting though, because intuitively you could argue, why wouldn't games be the best way of dealing with complexity, right? So you can put everything in one picture. In basically, how else would you otherwise do it, right? Just by doing everything on paper is of course an option, but it seems to be the viable one. So it's quite interesting. I mean, which area is the most relevant one in terms of using serious games? The most efficient one? There was only one area that was really striking, right? So hang on. Language, right? So said very clearly, for language learning, serious games seems to be the thing. I mean, seems to be very efficient in terms of expanding your knowledge. No measure on motivation though, so that's quite interesting as well from an insight point of view. Yep.
About language, you can probably learn without the very realistic videos.
Exactly.
So this
Possibly.
is simple schematics words. Then it could be put in a bit simpler context.
So looking at this, for especially, I mean, what could be done? What do the authors miss out on in this paper? Because meta-analyses are interesting because they usually, while they have a well-defined scope, they usually have an opportunity, if not even the obligation, to capture a part of the field comprehensively, right? They will be heavily read. They will be heavily cited, and future researchers will look at them. You see it quite explicitly because even they're just built on meta-analyses. Yeah, they of course they did some reviewed additional sources, additional studies, and so on. But pretty much they took everything from previous studies plus X, right? So now, since those papers have such importance in the fields, looking at this particular one, did you come up with any missed opportunities or shortcomings that you saw, or anyone really, when looking at that paper?
So as I shown on the other papers where they where the different modules were used, because this is this kind of they define it, for the motivation context. They use some kind of the definitions. They use quite precise criteria, but you could cluster those studies in a different way. So even the same choice of studies could probably let you come to the new conclusions. There were not that many experimental studies at the time of the publishing of the paper. So and only one of them actually used these measurements of the biosignals or observations during the playing. So I think that this is the biggest opportunity is to make this kind of meta-analysis based on the papers that explicitly observe the players during the play, because then I think it's the best point when you can record some data that you could use for this analysis. So they merely built on the data that was published by the authors of the papers, and since we had this discussion about how reliability of the papers, about the peer reviews in the field, they didn't find any correlation between where there was published or not the paper, where it was reviewed or not. So it's not that obvious that those not published studies are good enough, or the other are not reliable.
But that's still meaningful insight, right? So they explicitly highlight this. They isolate the studies, so you can remove them if you want to rerun it more explicitly. But you may name some points, but can you think of other, or you as a class, can you think of other aspects that could have been extended or made more explicit, especially when reading the paper? Well, I give you a very hard and fast one. I think they have really good catalog of inclusion criteria, really good, in fact, right? So really systematic. What I missed though, I want to know where papers were filtered, right? So I actually want to go through your filter and run through, okay, hang on, you looked at certain aspects, you included only papers that were either including instructional methods or not, so I want to see those numbers. Then there was a focus that they would only use normal abled people, I believe. I'm not sure which term they used for this one. And then so on. So they had various criteria that they were actually constraining. They only use studies with real randomization. So what does that mean?
That was when the participants were not set on the playing. We're not playing the game that was like that. The participants were chosen to play a specific game, but they were kind of no individual scores.
Right.
That was possible to play which participant, which results came from which participant when they were all kind of generalized. So they didn't want to have this bias, and they also excluded There was also only non-disabled people in
Yeah,
the study, in
exactly.
the participants, because they didn't want, I suppose, have the bias because of the individual conditions that
Right.
could have effect
That's
on the
interesting.
scores or
Yeah.
or learning outcomes.
So
This is kind of the
So the filtering criteria are all good. I just want to see an overview because if you have a, what was the initial number of studies?
190.
190 and you arrive at 34, then slash 77 again.
It was 38 studies, but those studies
Decompose.
might have more than
Exactly.
one comparison.
But I want to see this breakdown. I want to see this filter, right? Because if you come from 190 to 38, that's the jump, right? You can't just say, hey, we came up with those, good luck. I want to retrace that a bit more, and that's where I want to see a bit more transparency. That's all I'm saying about the paper. I think the criteria were good. They were clear. They were explicit.
Criteria like for the review to follow the steps.
Exactly, right? So if you think about systematic literature review, that's a bit lacking there, I guess. But other than that, I think it's a very viable kind of approach. One other comment in terms of missed opportunities, they provide an extensive table of all the papers that they actually reviewed, right? It would have been a really nice touch because they're really open about the time of publication to some extent, to have a look at the serious games from a chronological perspective and see if there are trends over time. So both from a disciplinary point of view, has it been more, have serious games been used in certain disciplines over times more extensively? Perhaps they tried engineering, didn't work out, forgot about it, and only focused on language afterwards. No surprise they have such a high correlation, because you also need to anticipate that technology gets better, right? So you have there's no reflection of the sensory input and output that serious games could probably have. For example, language generation or language recognition or anything like this, right? So that can be features that can be produce considerable difference.
Probably as a moderator.
But we don't know. But we don't know. So, what kind of? So, meaning, I'm just saying they're missing out of a nice and easy and cheap opportunity to perhaps identify trends that perhaps help explain their outcomes more explicitly. But in worst case, just give us other insights about the field more generally, right? So that's a bit of just a missed opportunity. Nothing wrong. That's quite good. Other than that, what's your view of the paper for the ones that read it? What's the view of the paper?
Very excessive, so kind of hard to read.
Hard to read, okay, yeah. Anyone else? So this is a good example of a actually very thoroughly written paper, and has undergone clearly multiple reviewing stages, as far as I see that. In fact, it has been under review for over a year, and most certainly with a lot of feedback and opportunities for refinement. I think it's very well constructed and really worthwhile to read as an example of a good meta-analysis. As any time you find shortcomings, there will be opportunities for improvement and so on. But it's very clearly written. The theory build-up is very clean, so it really guides the narrative. So if you want to know, when we talk about how to guide the reader in a narrative structure, I think the paper does a really, really good job in doing that. So not just widely citing left and right, but actually having a motivation sitting behind it, and then clearly building up, okay, what do we understand as serious games, right? They didn't do so as clearly, for example, for motivation as they themselves admitted, right? So that's a different point, but that's more like a realization ex post, because they said, let's catch everything and funnel then afterwards, right? And then they realized, okay, we probably should have looked at motivation more carefully, but that's, a lesson learned there. And then they build up their theoretical framework, and they really come up, okay, how do we start? What are we interested in? Cognitive processes and motivation and so on. And then the hypothesis. What do we really want to test, right? Really clear. And you guys were able to extract that so nicely because it was written so clearly here, right? So both from a formatting, but also from an elaboration. And then they really set up the variables that are interesting in moderator variables. And they are reasonably explicit, given the point in time. We're talking 2013. At that time, systematic lit review was not really something in the education domain, but rather in engineering. So now it's more like, state of the art, I guess. But given that they're very explicit about the inclusion criteria and the catalog and the justification where sensible. So it's very, very nice. And of course, the discussion of the results is quite good. So in most cases, I felt, while it's not easy to read, I agree to some extent. I think they did a reasonably good job in not just putting numbers there, but explaining what they actually mean, right? So actually giving a justification of what the probable reasons are, and in many cases making reference to the relevant statistical tests they used and so on. Sure, it depends a bit where you're coming from. If you are from educational domain, that would be very easy to read, or even from psychological perspective. If we're coming from a comp side, there's a bit of mind bending, or from design, there will be the need for a bit of mind bending. But I think it's actually very, very well written as a paper, very clear, no typos, the structure is very clean, and the framing is good, and the ensuing discussion at the end. So even after reporting the results, most of us think, oh cool, we're done, finally, let's go home, right? No, not quite. So I actually see how does anything we actually explored and discussed feed back into the discussion, right? Not only identifying future work, future directions and so on, but actually recontextualize, meaning looking at stuff that has been discussed in the introduction, when they did this framing, and see what does that mean for the theory that has informed our paper and our study. What does it mean for the body of theory going for here? So for example, they introduced certain revisions, basically group-based and inclusive assignments work best, right? I think that's, or mixed approaches work best in conjunction with serious games. Which learning aspects are relevant, how far visuals are relevant and so on. They bring this all back, and how far the need for the role of the narrative is to be discussed. Also perhaps an aspect of cognitive load that they admit, and then the motivation shortcomings, of course, right? And then saying from here that's where we can go. So from a framing point of view, this paper is actually thoughtfully written and constructed. So that's really worthwhile, even looking at it from a bird's eye perspective. So not necessarily paying attention to all the details, because they may be more or less or not or whatever relevant, because it's 2013. But from a construction point of view, I would recommend everyone to kind of look at this paper, to really read it and just to understand how to go about it. It's a lot of work doing this. It's because if you look at the citations as well at the end, the reference section, it's extensive, right? So it's 2.5 pages of just two-ish pages of double column references. That's quite intense. So overall, I think a really good paper. If you pull that off as a student paper, well, guess what? Your A is kind of safe. But there's always bells and whistles you can attach, of course. But anyway, anyone who has, if anyone has a, I'm as anyone else, just a person. But if anyone has a conflicting or contrasting insight, or thinks, no, that paper's horrible, and tells me why, that's also equally valid.
I have a reader's bias, so I should not.
You have a selection bias because you picked that thing. So you're out already. But it would be worthwhile, even if you read it in afterthought and see, actually, I don't think it's really good because, right? So it may spawn insightful discussion. And because there's a lot of disciplinary bias as well, right? So, I mean, it comes from a certain discipline, it's written for a certain audience. So, and then for this audience, I think it's quite well written, but perhaps there may be misconceptions that persist. So if that's an issue for discussion, I'm more than happy to entertain this. Other than that, I would recommend to read this paper just to see how a well-structured paper is written for now. So after the extended discussion of this first paper, I think the audience deserves a break.
Yes.
Yep. What time? How long? 15? 8 minutes? Yeah? 15:15, we continue. Talk about the second paper, and then it will be interesting for you.
Yeah.
That's right.